I think it's important to talk about it because, the old adage, if you don't know your history, it's doomed to repeat itself, right? And I think that we're kind of approaching that time right now. It's been decades of us not talking about race, not talking about racism, not talking about how racism impacts the experiences and opportunities of a variety of people in this nation. And I think the more we talk about it and the more we recognize experiences of people different from us, the more likely we are to fight for equality and equity for those people. And of course, make a better nation as a result. And, quietly moving along and, meandering about and recognizing that, ooh, that was kind of racist, but let me keep my mouth shut because I don't want to be uncomfortable. I think that's kind of what has gotten us to this, and a lot of people call this a powder keg moment, right? That's just about to blow. And I can't say for sure, if we'd been more open about race, things would have been better off, but I can just assume going forward that this new generation, especially the young people, of course, most young people start protests, right? They're just getting tired of feeling the way they're feeling. And some of them recognize the history of their parents and grandparents, and others don't. They just realize that I'm not being treated fairly right now, so I'm going to get up and talk about it. And I think that going forward, this generation is going to be a lot more open. I made a post on Facebook a while back about, sort of my experiences talking about race in the classroom. And one of those is just that, I'm a Black woman teaching a class, and it's sociology, so you talk about race and class and gender identity and all of these subjects that many people just don't have conversations about at home, And those are things that you were taught, don't talk about race at the table, don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion. And here we are in a class setting, and I'm expecting you to discuss things with me based on, your own social location, your own race, class, gender, sexuality. And so I typically approach it like everyone has an open mind. Of course, it doesn't always work out that way, but I want everyone to feel as comfortable as I do talking about the subject. And I do teach my classes a little differently than most because I encourage discussion in my class. I tend not to lecture as much, kind of depends on the level of the class. But in my introductory classes, for instance, that's usually when I get the most pushback because those classes students have to take. They have to take a sociology or a psychology course. Most of them are non-majors, so there might be engineer majors or nursing majors or whatever in my course that just never cared to take sociology before. So they come into the course and they're like, oh my gosh, this Black woman's talking about race too much. I talk about it the same amount as, maybe a little bit more than some of my other colleagues, but because you're seeing my race and recognizing my color as a race, it brings a little bit of a nuance to the conversation that we're having in class. And so I try to approach it like, everyone is open-minded, but I also recognize that there will be pushback, if not out loud, either in papers or, when they go home to discuss these conversations with their parents. I've had students drop out of my courses because of my hope that they will have conversations about some of these topics. And so it's interesting because some people just don't want to learn and don't want to know anything different. And that's sometimes not any fault of their own. You are raised, you're socialized by your family, your friends, your religious institutions. And if it's a space in which you don't ever feel comfortable talking about it, you kind of won't get there. But when I approach it in my upper level classes, it's a little different because they're sociology majors. They know what sociology is, that study of society. They recognize we're going to talk about these subjects. So I talk straight up about, why we even have to have this talk and why it's certain communities that have to have the talk versus, other communities that have more privilege and power. I don't know if I can say a biggest challenge. Because that challenge is expected. I think it is the pushback of students who just don't want to recognize race. Like, I don't get any students that think, everyone is born at a lower status, or some people are born at a lower status. So they want to express that out loud anyways, right? In polite company, because it's still not so cool to talk about being, a white supremacist, right? But I can feel it in class. The class goes crickets sometimes when you start approaching these topics that are quite sensitive. But that's what sociology is about. That's what going to college is about. And I typically start talking about race first day of class. I do an introduction assignment. I teach from this pedagogical stance that says my students have to know me to be able to want to learn from me. And so I tell them about myself. I tell them I like to travel. Sometimes I make a joke about, hey, this is me, I'm Black, and just get it out in the open just so that everyone knows. And it kind of gets a laugh, but it also, says, hey, we're going to talk about these topics day one, and you're going to have to get used to it. Of course, we're talking about a whole bunch of other topics, but even when we talk about religion, and I ask, what religious practices are you familiar with? Most people, talk about Protestant practices. And then we, start talking about practices of countries in the Middle East, and they're like, ooh, I don't really know too much about that. But that's race too. Those people who are from the Middle East are perceived in this country a lot differently than people who are Black. Maybe not a lot, but for varied reasons. And so we don't talk about just Black and white. We talk about a variety of races. And we also talk about how it's socially constructed. And I think that might be the biggest challenge right there. For students to realize that race is created. The idea that social construction is the idea that we create the power behind what we perceive as race. So the categories of race have even changed over time. If you look at the first census, Black people were enslaved peoples, and they weren't people. They were three-fifths, of course, about all of that. But as you look at the names of what people were called, Negro, right, colored, Native Americans were called Indians. You had Filipino, Japanese, and then they kind of all got clumped into Asian. And had Chicano, I think, on a census, to look at Mexican peoples that were in California. And so the names at which we have called people have changed over time. And I think that's one of the easiest ways it is for me to help students to understand that race as a category is socially constructed. And I also do this exercise about, getting on an airplane, and you can go somewhere on an airplane and you can be a different race when you get there, because the racial categories vary across countries. I mean, if I were to fly over to Brazil right now, they might look at me as an American, yes, but if they were to look at my color of my skin, they'd use race a little differently over there, more as a color gradient. So it kind of depends on your skin tone. And people in the same family could be different races because their skin tones might be different. So let's say you and I were brother and sister, because your skin tone is so much lighter than mine, you'd be a whole nother race than I am. So it's very different the way certain countries perceive race and the power that they give to certain racial categories. But we know worldwide, because of European dominance in colonization, we see that white privilege exists in almost every space on the country or in the world. So we have to recognize that fact too. And I think that's another challenge as well. Recognizing that race is socially constructed is also recognizing that white privilege doesn't mean that you haven't had hardships as a white person. You could be a poor white person. But the privilege is that your race, your skin tone hasn't been one of those hardships. And so it's kind of knocking that into students' heads to realize that, I'm not docking you. I know that you have to get a scholarship to come to school. I know that you may have been poor. And I sympathize with you and I empathize with you. But because you're white, you haven't had to think about the stare down that you might get in the store was because of your race. Maybe it was because of your class, right? And so it's kind of hard to pinpoint a definition of the talk, because it varies depending on the family and your social location. So, of course, generally speaking, it's a conversation that parents generally have with their children, or guardians have with their children, and mostly Black children and students, or children rather, that are in economically depressed areas possibly, or areas in which they recognize their youth are at a greater chance of being assaulted or approached by the police when they are just existing. And so to have that conversation is different for everyone, because it depends on the area, it depends on your own race, your class, your social location, even your prominence within the community. All of that matters as to how and why you're going to have the talk. And of course, you've probably seen like 20 million book lists out there of all the books you should probably read, the documentaries you should watch, how to, whatever. I think that it is very helpful for individuals who have one perspective at home to get another perspective from someone else. And if they're not going to go out and approach someone that's different from them, if they can read it or hear it or catch it on a TV show or whatever, that these conversations need to be had. I think that's really important. But I think it's just important for everyone to at least be cognizant of the varied experiences of people from different races, and recognize that it's not all good for everyone, it's not all bad for everyone, and there are, a whole lot of oppressions that people experience, and some experience more of those oppressions, and some experience fewer of those. And I think that as long as we as a society start to recognize those differences, we'll be a little bit better off. And especially if upon recognizing those differences, we do something to make things more equal and equitable, I think we'll be a lot better off. There was a sermon I was listening to, I think it was maybe just NPR, but it was somebody that was giving a talk, and they were like, find someone that's different from you and hug them, right? Don't do that on the street because that's kind of weird. But at the same time, reach out to people who are different from you, and, spark up a conversation. If it's just at the bar or, at the library or something like that, or a person that you work with, if you care, right? Or if you want to know a little bit more about people's experiences. And there are just so many people that are out there that are willing to talk, that I don't think anyone should be without a conversation about race, racism, racial discrimination, prejudice, if they don't want to. They can come to a museum. Hey, look, right? And learn a little bit and talk to people about their experiences. And I think that would just be an amazing thing. So you don't have to go to college to get that conversation. You can, do it on your own.